There is a particular kind of silence that does not feel like peace. It is not the silence of a library, where you understand the rules, where the stillness is voluntary and civilized. It is not the silence of a bedroom at 3 in the morning, where the absence of noise is simply the absence of the day. This silence, the kind I am about to describe, carries weight. It presses against your eardrums like water at depth. It makes you suddenly, profoundly aware of every sound your own body produces. Your heartbeat. The wet click of your throat when you swallow. The sound your eyelids make when you blink, which you have never noticed before in your entire life, but now, in this silence, seems almost unbearably loud. I entered that forest on a Tuesday in October. I want you to remember that detail, because later, when everything I understood about perception and reality and the reliable nature of the physical world began to quietly come apart, the ordinariness of that fact was the one thing I kept returning to. A Tuesday. In October. Not a full moon, not a midnight hour, not the kind of dramatic atmospheric circumstance that stories usually require. Just an overcast morning, a gravel access road, and a gate with a faded government sign that had been locked for 20 years. I had a key. That key had cost me 3 years of my life, 2 federal information requests, 1 relationship I will never fully recover from, and a degree of professional humiliation I had learned to wear like a second skin. By the time I stood in front of that gate, the key already felt like it weighed more than it should. Like it was made of something denser than ordinary metal. I want to be clear about something before we go any further, because I think it matters enormously. What I am about to tell you is the kind of story that, when you hear it in the daylight, in a warm room, with the comfortable noise of the world around you, sounds like it belongs to someone else. Someone credulous. Someone who went looking for something and allowed their imagination to colonize their reason. I was a wilderness researcher for 11 years. I have camped alone at altitude in February. I have navigated by compass in zero visibility. I have been genuinely, operationally lost in remote terrain twice in my career, and both times I found my way out by staying calm and trusting my training. I am telling you all of this so that you understand what it means when I tell you that, by the 3rd night inside that restricted zone, I did not trust my own senses anymore. And I am telling you that I believe what I experienced was real. The gate opened on October 14th. And what was waiting on the other side of it had been waiting for 20 years. Come with me. My name is Daniel Voss. I am 41 years old. I grew up in the Pacific Northwest, in a small town that existed primarily as a service community for the timber industry, which meant that the forest was not a romantic abstraction for me the way it seems to be for many people who discover wilderness later in life. The forest was infrastructure. It was the thing that employed your father and your father's friends. It was the smell that the town carried in its clothes, a permanent atmospheric signature of pine resin and damp earth and chainsaw exhaust. When I was a child, the trees were not mysterious. They were just enormous, and they were everywhere, and sometimes men cut them down, and sometimes they did not. It was my mother who gave me the other relationship, the one that eventually defined my career and, in some ways, I think, my character. She was a botanist by training and a naturalist by temperament, and on weekend mornings she would take me into the older sections of the forest, the sections that the timber industry had not yet reached or had decided were not worth the effort, and she would teach me to read the landscape the way other parents taught their children to read books. She could identify species by the architecture of their bark from 30 feet away. She could determine the age of a stand of trees by the way light moved through the canopy. She knew the difference between a forest that was healthy and a forest that was in distress, and she communicated this knowledge to me not as a series of facts to be memorized but as a sensory language to be learned, the way you learn music, through practice and repetition and patient attention. What I remember most from those mornings is not any particular species or any particular technique. What I remember is the feeling of learning to pay attention. The feeling of the world becoming more legible, more detailed, more astonishingly complex the more closely you were willing to look at it. My mother used to say that most people walked through a forest the way they drove through a city, aware of the broad shapes of things, the general layout, the intended routes. but completely blind to the extraordinary density of information that surrounded them at every moment. She died when I was 19. A sudden illness, the kind that does not negotiate and does not provide the courtesy of a long decline during which you can prepare yourself. She was there in September, and by December she was not. I finished my degree in environmental science, completed a master's in wilderness ecology, and eventually found my way into a career that would have made her laugh, because it was so thoroughly her description of what she thought I should do with my life, and I had spent most of my teenage years insisting I wanted to do something completely different. I became a wilderness researcher. I spent my career in the field, documenting ecosystem changes, studying the long-term behavioral patterns of old-growth forest environments, assessing areas of unusual ecological activity for various government and academic clients. I was good at the work. I was precise and patient, and I had inherited my mother's ability to pay attention without looking for what you expected to find. This quality, the ability to observe without predetermined conclusion, was precisely what brought me to the Veldran Corridor. That is not its official name. I am going to be careful here, and I want to explain why without being coy about it. The location I am describing is real in the sense that it occupies real geographic coordinates in a real national wilderness area in the northern United States. But I am not going to give you those coordinates, and I am not going to use the government designation, and I am not going to tell you which national forest it technically falls within. Not because I am hiding government secrets. I am not a government employee. I carry no security clearance. I violated no formal legal agreement by entering this area. But because I have thought very carefully, in the months since I came back out, about what it would mean for other people to go there looking for what I found. I have thought about that in the way you think about a door that you are not certain should be opened again. I call it the Veldran Corridor because that was the name used in the earliest internal report I found, a survey document from the 1970s that had been misfiled in a regional ecological archive and had spent 30 years being technically available to the public while remaining practically invisible because nobody knew to look for it. Veldran is not a word I have been able to trace to any language or any named person. It simply appears in that document as though it had always been there, as though whoever wrote it expected the reader to already understand what it meant. The corridor designation refers to a roughly 18-mile-long section of old-growth forest that runs along the northern face of a long ridge system, bounded on one side by a river that is not navigable, and on the other by an escarpment that is not easily climbed. It is geographically isolated in the way that very few places in the continental United States remain geographically isolated. There are no roads into it. There are no maintained trails. The nearest trailhead is 11 miles from the nearest edge of the area, and to reach that edge you must cross the river, which in October runs cold enough to cause hypothermia within 20 minutes of immersion. The area had been administratively restricted for 20 years. The official explanation, and when I say official I mean the explanation given in response to public information requests, which I had been filing, with steadily increasing specificity, for 3 years, was ecological sensitivity. The restricted designation protected a rare fungal network from recreational disturbance. This explanation was not implausible. Such designations exist. I had worked in areas with similar protections. But there were details in the ecological sensitivity designation that did not add up, details that a layperson would not notice but that someone with my background could not easily dismiss. The first detail was the timing. The area had been restricted in early November, 20 years ago, following a specific incident. The incident was described in the restriction documentation as an adverse ecological event requiring further study. This language is unusual. In my experience, ecological events are described in precise technical terms. Adverse is a word you use in legal documents, not scientific ones. Requiring further study is a phrase that acknowledges ignorance, and government ecological designations almost never acknowledge ignorance. They use language that implies a complete understanding of the situation, even when that understanding is approximate. The second detail was the survey gap. In the 3 decades before the restriction, the area had been surveyed with the regularity you would expect from an actively managed wilderness section. Botanical surveys, wildlife assessments, soil composition studies, aerial photography. And then, beginning approximately 4 years before the restriction, the surveys stopped. Not reduced, not decreased in frequency, stopped entirely. There was no record of any authorized entry into the area for 4 years before the restriction was formally put in place. The restriction formalized an absence that had already begun quietly and without explanation. The third detail was the one that I came back to most often in the years before I finally found a way in. In the archive that contained the misfiled Veldran survey document, there was a secondary file, a handwritten note clipped to the inside cover of a manila folder that contained nothing else. The note was not dated. It was written in a precise, unhurried hand, the kind of handwriting that belongs to someone who was educated in an era when handwriting was taught as a discipline rather than a practical skill. It said simply, "The trees remember what we have forgotten. Do not go back unless you are certain you can tolerate knowing." I did not know what to do with that sentence for a long time. I still don't fully. But I could not stop reading it. I want to tell you about the drive, because the drive matters in a way I did not understand until later. I had been in the field enough times to know that the approach to a wilderness assignment carries its own emotional logic, separate from whatever you expect to find at the destination. There is something about the progressive disappearance of infrastructure, the 4-lane highway narrowing to 2 lanes, the 2 lanes giving way to maintained gravel, the maintained gravel deteriorating into unmaintained double track, the double track ending at a gate, that acts on the nervous system in a specific way. Each reduction in the density of human presence is experienced not just as a geographic fact but as a psychological one. You feel yourself becoming more alone in discrete, measurable increments. It is usually a feeling I enjoy. This time it was different. I noticed it first about 40 minutes from the gate, when the cell's signal dropped to nothing. The signal drop itself was completely expected. I had noted the coverage gap on the map, and I had a satellite communicator as a backup. But something about the moment the signal vanished produced a reaction in me that I did not expect. Not anxiety, exactly. Something quieter than anxiety. Something more like the sensation you get when you are reading a novel and you suddenly realize, 3/4 of the way through, that the story is not going to end the way you assumed it would. A subtle reorientation of expectation. The sky overhead had been overcast since dawn, the kind of flat gray October sky that does not develop or change, that simply persists. The trees along the road, second and third growth forest here, nothing like what waited inside the corridor, stood close on both sides, their lower branches reaching the edges of the gravel with a kind of passive insistence, as if the road itself was something they were in the process of slowly reclaiming. The temperature had been dropping since I left the highway. By the time I reached the end of the double track, my breath was visible in the air when I stepped out of the truck, a brief ghost materializing and dissolving with every exhalation. The gate was exactly as it appeared in the aerial photographs I had studied. Metal frame, government-issue padlock, a sign that had once been clearly legible but had weathered to a condition where you had to already know what it said to parse the remaining letters. Restricted access. No unauthorized entry. And at the bottom, in smaller text that had fared even worse against the weather, something that I could only make out partially, for your safety and the preservation of. I stood in front of that gate for longer than I expected to. This is not something I would normally include in any kind of professional account. A researcher standing in front of a gate, hesitating, is not a detail that belongs in a field report. But I have committed to telling you this accurately, which means I have to tell you about the hesitation, because the hesitation was real and it came from somewhere I did not entirely understand. It was not fear of physical danger. I was well equipped, well trained, and the area presented no particular technical hazard that I had not prepared for. It was something else. Something closer to the feeling I mentioned a moment ago, the sense of a story moving in an unexpected direction. I thought about my mother. I do not know why. I had not thought about her with any particular intensity in years, and this was not the kind of moment that seemed to invite sentimentality. But she was suddenly there, very vivid and very present, the way she sometimes appeared in the instant before sleep, her face turned toward a canopy of old trees, one hand raised to shield her eyes from the light. I unlocked the gate and walked through. The first thing I noticed was the temperature differential. Within the first 50 meters of the gate, the temperature dropped perceptibly. I noted it as a physical fact before I had processed it analytically. A sudden deepening of the cold, the kind of cold that has texture, that feels like it is coming from the ground as much as from the air. This is not unusual in dense forest, particularly on the north-facing slope of a ridge system. The canopy intercepts solar radiation. The ground retains moisture. The ambient temperature in an old-growth forest can run several degrees cooler than the surrounding landscape. I made a note of it. The second thing I noticed was the canopy. I had seen photographs of old-growth forest. I had worked in old-growth forests before, in various regions and ecosystem types. But the photographs and the experience, as is always the case, had not prepared me for the specific quality of the canopy in the Veldran corridor. The trees were enormous, several Engelmann spruce and subalpine fir that I estimated at 400 and 500 years old, with trunk diameters I could not have encircled with both arms extended. The canopy they created was extraordinarily dense, to the point where the light reaching the forest floor was dim even by old-growth standards, a kind of deep green-gray twilight that seemed to belong to a different time of day than the one I had left at the gate. I checked my watch. It was 9:47 in the morning. The light felt like late afternoon. The third thing I noticed was the quiet. This is the quiet I described at the beginning. I want to try to be precise about it, because the language of quiet is difficult. We tend to use the same word for all absences of sound, which obscures the fact that different kinds of quiet have completely different qualities, the way different kinds of darkness are actually entirely different experiences. The quiet inside the corridor was not the ambient quiet of a forest in which natural sounds are simply present at a low volume. It was the quiet of a space from which sound had been removed. There were no bird calls. There was no movement in the underbrush, no small animal rustling, none of the insect ambience that characterizes forest environments even in October. The wind, which had been intermittent on the approach road, was absent here. The only sound was the sound of my own movement, footsteps on damp needlefall, the soft resistance of undergrowth against my gaiters, the slight creak of my pack straps. I had been in quiet forests before. Old-growth forest tends toward quiet, and an overcast October morning is not a period of peak wildlife activity. But this was different in a way I found difficult to articulate in my field notes, and I noticed that I was writing around the difficulty rather than through it, describing what was absent rather than what was present, as if the truth of the place existed primarily in its omissions. I set up my base camp at the edge of a small clearing approximately 2 miles in from the gate. The clearing was roughly circular, perhaps 30 meters in diameter, and its origin was unclear. It was too perfectly shaped to be the result of random wind throw or tree death, but there was no sign of deliberate clearing, no evidence of cut stumps or historic human activity. The ground at its center was covered in a low, very dense moss that was a color I found myself wanting to describe as dark green but which, when I examined it closely, was actually closer to a very deep blue-gray, a color that moss, in my experience, does not produce. I photographed it extensively. I noted in my field journal that the clearing felt central. That is an observation that belongs more to psychology than to ecology, and I am aware of that. But it was what I noted. It felt central in the way that a town square feels central, or a stage, or the open space at the heart of any structure that has been designed to direct movement toward a specific point. I was standing in a forest that had not been accessed by humans for at least 20 years, possibly much longer, and I was writing the word central in my field notes, as though it were a scientific observation. I should have paid more attention to that. The first night was cold and still and, on its surface, uneventful. I want to emphasize the surface qualification, because one of the things I have come to understand about the way the corridor operates on perception is that the significant things often do not announce themselves as significant when they occur. They register at a level slightly below conscious attention, accumulating in the way that certain kinds of fatigue accumulate. Not a single blow but a slow, patient pressure that you don't fully notice until you try to stand and find that your legs are less reliable than they were. I ate, reviewed my notes, checked my equipment, and climbed into my sleeping bag at 9 in the evening. The temperature inside the tent was manageable. I was well equipped for cold weather, but the absence of forest sound continued. I lay in the dark and listened for anything, any evidence of the animal life that the area's ecological history suggested should be present, and heard nothing. This continued to feel wrong in a way I could not quite systematize. Old-growth forest in restricted areas typically shows elevated wildlife density due to the absence of human disturbance. The silence I was hearing was the opposite of what I expected from a 20-year human absence. It was the silence of an area that something had vacated. I slept eventually, heavily, without dreaming that I remembered. In the morning, my field notes from the previous evening were accurate and undisturbed. The moss in the clearing, which I had photographed extensively the afternoon before, looked different in the morning light. Not dramatically different. Not impossibly different. But I spent an uncomfortable 20 minutes comparing my evening photographs to what I was now observing, trying to determine whether the difference was real or a product of changed light conditions, and I could not resolve the question. The blue-gray color of the moss appeared, in the morning, to have deepened. Or perhaps the surface texture had changed slightly. Or perhaps the light on an overcast morning and the light on an overcast late afternoon were simply different enough to account for the discrepancy. I noted it. I moved on. The second day I worked the eastern section of my survey area, documenting tree species and diameters, collecting soil samples, photographing the understory at regular intervals. The work was absorbing and familiar, and for several hours the strangeness of the place receded to a manageable background quality, present but not intrusive, the way a slight ringing in the ears is present but not intrusive when you are occupied with something that requires attention. And then I found the structures. I want to be precise about this word, because I used it in my field notes, and later questioned whether it was accurate. What I found were not buildings. They were not human construction in any conventional sense. They were arrangements. Arrangements of materials that existed naturally in the forest, branches, stones, sections of fallen timber, assembled in configurations that were geometrically regular enough that you could not attribute them to chance, but that did not correspond to any structural purpose I could identify. They were not walls. They were not shelters. They were not anything that a person building something would build for any practical reason. There were 11 of them in the eastern section, distributed without apparent pattern across an area of roughly half a mile. Each arrangement was different in its specific composition but consistent in certain qualities. The materials were placed with a precision that bordered on the obsessive, each branch and stone positioned with what appeared to be deliberate care. The arrangements varied in scale from roughly 1 meter across to perhaps 4 meters across. Some were low, flat configurations of stones with branches laid across them at specific angles. Others were vertical, stones balanced in configurations that should not have been stable but were, that seemed to contradict in a quiet way what you expected gravity and physics to permit. I photographed everything. I took measurements. I recorded GPS coordinates for each arrangement. I was careful not to touch any of them, not out of squeamishness but out of the professional discipline of preserving an undisturbed scene for proper documentation. In my field notes I wrote, with deliberate clinical precision, that the arrangements were of uncertain origin and purpose, possibly historic human activity, possibly animal behavior, requiring further investigation. I used the word possibly twice in the same sentence, which is something I would not normally do. Uncertainty is something you acknowledge once and then move past. I could not move past it here. I did not mention in my field notes what I actually felt when I stood among those arrangements, because it was not something that belonged in a field report, and I was still, at this point, trying to maintain the posture of the researcher rather than the person. What I felt was this: the sensation that I had arrived somewhere that had been expecting me. Not me specifically, perhaps, but someone. Something with eyes and the capacity to move through the world. The arrangements felt like a prepared space. And the forest around the arrangements was quieter than the already impossibly quiet forest around my camp, quieter in a way that seemed localized, specific to the arrangements themselves, as if they generated their own silence the way a magnet generates a field. I went back to camp before the light faded. That evening I sat outside my tent in the gathering dark and wrote up my notes, and at some point I became aware that I had been writing for a long time and that it was fully dark now, and that I had not noticed the transition. In most wilderness environments, the transition from dusk to darkness is something you feel, a gradual cooling and quieting and closing in that your nervous system registers before your conscious mind does. Here the dark had simply arrived, without the usual preparation, the way a door closes in another room. I turned on my headlamp. Its beam cut into the dark between the trees and illuminated, for a moment, nothing unusual. Just the trees, close and enormous, their bark the color of old concrete in the artificial light, their canopy impenetrable above. I turned off the headlamp. I do not know why I did this. It was not a rational decision. It was the kind of impulse that has a physical quality, like an instinct that acts before the reasoning mind can offer an objection. And in the dark, the profound, dense dark of an old-growth forest on an overcast night, with no moon and no stars and no ambient light from any human source, I sat and listened to the silence and felt something that I am going to call, with full awareness of how this sounds, attention. Not the attention of a person. Not the attention of an animal in any conventional sense. Something larger and slower and far more patient than either. The sensation of being observed by something that had no reason to hurry, because it had been there long enough that waiting had become indistinguishable from existing. I turned the headlamp back on. I went inside my tent. I lay in my sleeping bag and stared at the tent ceiling and listened to the silence for a long time before sleep finally came. On the morning of the third day, I found my footprints. This requires explanation, because the finding of footprints in a place you have been is not, on its face, alarming. I had been moving through the corridor for 2 days. I had left marks on the landscape, compressed needlefall, bent undergrowth, the occasional boot impression in soft ground near the drainage areas. This is normal. This is expected. This is what a person moving through a forest leaves behind. What I found on the morning of the third day was a set of my own footprints. I identified them by the specific tread pattern of my boot, which is distinctive enough to be unmistakable, in a location I had not been. The footprints appeared in a section of soft ground approximately a quarter mile northwest of my camp, in a direction I had not surveyed and had not traveled. They tracked clearly through the soft ground for roughly 30 meters and then stopped, not at an area of harder ground where they would naturally become invisible, but simply stopped, the way a sentence stops. I stood looking at them for a long time. The rational explanations were available to me and I deployed them in order, with the methodical patience of someone who has trained themselves to exhaust the likely before considering the unlikely. I could have walked that route in the night without full awareness, not impossible, though I had no memory of it, and the tent door zipper, which I always closed completely before sleeping, had been fully closed when I woke. The tread pattern could be from a boot other than mine, unlikely, given the specificity of the match, but not impossible. The prints could have been made on a previous occasion by someone else who happened to own the same boot model, possible in theory, though the area had been restricted for 20 years. I examined each of these possibilities with genuine care, and I could not make any of them fully convincing. What I could not examine with the same care was the simpler and more disturbing possibility, which was that the prints were mine and I had made them and I did not remember making them. This possibility had implications I was not ready to sit with on a cold October morning in an isolated forest with no cell signal and a gate 11 miles behind me. I went back to camp and ate breakfast and drank coffee and reviewed my survey plan for the day, and I decided to work the western section, which would keep me close to camp and give me a clear, direct return route in the event that I felt the need to return early. This was a practical decision that I made for entirely professional reasons, and the fact that it also kept me as far as possible from the location of the footprints was a coincidence that I noted and then declined to think about. The western section was different from the eastern section in a quality that was initially difficult to name. The trees were the same species, comparable in age and scale. The understory composition was similar. The soil characteristics, when I sampled them, were nearly identical. But the western section felt older. This is not a scientific observation. Age in an ecosystem is measurable. Tree ring counts, soil carbon dating, the accumulation of structural complexity over time, and I was not equipped to conduct those measurements in the field. What I mean by older is more subjective, more difficult, and I think more honest. The western section felt as though it had been in the process of becoming what it was for a longer time than the eastern section. As though the degree of completion was different. As though whatever process the forest was engaged in was further along here. I was writing in metaphors. I noticed this about my field notes around midday, and it unsettled me, because field notes are not supposed to contain metaphors. They are supposed to contain observations. But I could not seem to write about the western section in any other language. Every time I tried to be precise and clinical, the words slipped into something more oblique, more imagistic. As if the place resisted direct description the way certain surfaces resist paint. In the western section I also found the markers. These were different from the arrangements in the eastern section. Older, much older, in the sense that they had clearly been in place long enough to be partially absorbed into the landscape. Wooden stakes driven into the ground at approximately 10-meter intervals, their upper ends carved into shapes that were either abstract or representational depending on the distance from which you viewed them. From a distance of 5 or 6 meters, they appeared purely geometric, simple shapes, lozenges and spirals and configurations that looked almost like letters from an alphabet you had never seen. Standing directly over them, something in the carving resolved into something almost figurative, almost a face or a hand or an eye, but never quite clearly enough to confirm, always hovering at the threshold of recognition. The stakes were not from the last 20 years. The degree of weathering and the extent to which the surrounding root systems had grown around and incorporated the base of each stake suggested they had been in the ground for a minimum of several decades, possibly much longer. They were not government survey markers. They were not hunting or trapping markers. They were not any kind of trail marker I had ever encountered in any wilderness system. They were also, and this is the detail I keep returning to, arranged in a pattern. Not a pattern I could identify from the ground, but a pattern I could feel the logic of the way you can feel the logic of a poem in a language you don't speak, a sense of internal structure without access to meaning. I photographed everything. I measured the distances between stakes. I sketched the carvings. And in the margin of my sketch notes I wrote, in handwriting that seemed slightly less controlled than my usual field hand, 3 words that I do not entirely remember writing. They mark something. I found this notation later that evening, when I reviewed my notes by lamplight. I sat with those 3 words for a long time. I could not disagree with them. That evening, the forest made a sound. I want to be careful here. I want to resist the temptation toward the dramatic, because the temptation is strong and the dramatic version of this story would be easy to construct. A howl. A voice. A clear, impossible sound that announced itself without ambiguity as the product of something that should not be there. It was not like that. The sound the forest made, and I am using that phrasing deliberately, the forest made, because the sound did not seem to come from any specific location within the forest but from the forest as a whole, as if the trees themselves were producing it, was very low and very slow. Below the threshold of clear audibility in certain moments, present at the edge of perception rather than inside it. It had a rhythm that was not regular in the way of machinery but organic in the way of breathing, or in the way of ocean waves, a rhythm that varied within a pattern, that had the quality of something alive rather than something mechanical. I sat outside my tent for 40 minutes and listened to it. I made an audio recording on my field recorder, noting the time and location and ambient conditions. I still have that recording. I have listened to it many times since my return. It records exactly nothing, the silence of the forest, undifferentiated and empty. Whatever I heard that evening, my recorder did not capture it. This is the kind of detail that, reported to the wrong audience, generates the wrong kind of attention. I know this. I am not claiming that a forest made a sound audible to a human ear but inaudible to recording equipment for any mysterious or supernatural reason. The most likely explanation is that what I heard was infrasound, very low frequency vibration below the conventional threshold of hearing but perceivable through the body, particularly in conditions of extreme quiet where normal auditory masking is absent. Infrasound is produced by a variety of natural phenomena, including large-scale geological processes, wind interaction with terrain, and the movement of massive tree trunks in an old-growth stand. It is known to produce unsettling physical and psychological effects in humans, including anxiety, awe, the sense of a presence, and in some cases mild visual disturbance. There is a solid body of research on this. I wrote this explanation in my field notes that night, carefully and thoroughly. Then I sat with the explanation for a while, the way you sit with an answer on an examination to determine whether it actually answers the question or merely appears to. The infrasound explanation accounted for the sensation. It did not account for the rhythm. Geological infrasound is not rhythmic in the specific way I was describing. Wind-driven infrasound varies with wind speed, which in the corridor was essentially zero. The infrasound produced by large trees in motion requires the trees to be in motion, and they were not. The rhythm I was describing was something between a resting heartbeat and the breathing of a very large, very calm animal. I wrote this down also. Then I put my notebook away and went to sleep. The dream I had that night has not left me. I want to address the status of dreams carefully, because I think it matters. I am not going to present what I dreamed as evidence of anything. Dreams are the brain's processing engine, metabolizing the experiences and anxieties and sensory data of the waking day into narrative, and being in an unusual and unsettling place would predictably produce unusual and unsettling dreams. I hold this understanding firmly. And yet, the dream was this: I was standing in the clearing with the blue-gray moss. It was daytime in the dream, or something close to daytime. The light was present but sourceless, the way light in old photographs is present but not quite attached to any sun. The trees around the clearing were the trees I had been walking among for 2 days, enormous and still, their bark reading in that strange light as something almost biological, almost skin. The moss under my feet was luminous in a way moss is not luminous, not glowing exactly but lit from within, or lit from very deep below. In the dream I understood, not as information I was receiving from any external source, but as a certainty that was simply present in me the way spatial orientation is simply present when you wake, that I was standing in a place that had been standing before me. Not in the trivial sense that forests are old and human presence is recent. In a different sense. In the sense that the clearing and its moss and the trees around it had been, for an extraordinarily long time, oriented toward the moment of being observed. As though the forest had been arranged in the expectation of a witness, and I was the witness it had been arranged for, and the arrangement had been waiting with a patience that made 20 years feel like nothing, that made all of recorded human time feel like the briefest interruption of something much older and much more complete. In the dream, I sat down on the moss. And the sound came, the infrasound, the rhythm, but in the dream it was fully audible, fully present, no longer at the threshold. And it was not threatening. That is the detail that has stayed with me most persistently. It was not threatening. It was something I do not have an adequate word for. The closest I can come is that it was welcoming, but welcoming in a register so different from the human emotional vocabulary of welcome that the word barely applies. It was welcoming in the way that a very old gravitational body welcomes things into its orbit, not with intent, not with desire, but with the simple, enormous, completely impersonal fact of itself. I woke up at 2:43 in the morning. I lay perfectly still in my sleeping bag and listened to the silence of the forest. Then I took out my recorder, made a timestamp note, and spoke into it for approximately 20 minutes, describing the dream as clearly and completely as I could while it was still fully present. I have transcribed those 20 minutes. They form the core of what I am telling you now. I want to tell you what else I noticed when I woke from that dream. I was not afraid. For the first time since walking through the gate, I was not afraid. This should, perhaps, have frightened me more than anything else. The 4th day. I worked the central section of my survey area, which meant returning to the clearing with the blue-gray moss. I had been oriented toward this return since leaving it on the first day, in the way that you can be oriented towards something without fully acknowledging the orientation to yourself. I had extensive documentation from the first visit. I had good reasons to go back for comparative data. The professional logic was solid, The other logic, the dream, the sense of the clearing as a center, the pull that I am describing as honest because I committed to honesty when I began this account, was also present, and I was not going to pretend otherwise. The clearing looked the same and did not feel the same. I know how this sounds. I know that feelings are not data. But the researcher's job, at the most fundamental level, is to describe what is there as accurately as possible, and what was there was a clearing that occupied the same physical space as the clearing I had documented 2 days before, with the same moss and the same circular geometry, and the same dense canopy overhead, and it felt substantively different. Older is the word that came to me again. Not more weathered or more decayed, either of those applies. Simply older, as though 2 days had been, in the clearing's own measure of time, a significant duration. I set up my instruments and began my documentation. This is where things become difficult to write. Not because the events are particularly dramatic. Nothing that occurred during those 4 hours in the clearing would scan as dramatic if I described it to someone who had not been there. A researcher sitting in a clearing, taking measurements, making notes. But the experience of those 4 hours was something I have not found adequate language for, and I have been trying for months. The best I can do is this: for 4 hours, I was entirely certain that I was not alone. Not in the sense of perceived threat. Not in the sense of human presence. I had no reason to suspect another person was anywhere near me, and whatever I was perceiving was not compatible with human presence in any case. The certainty of not being alone was more fundamental than that. It was the kind of certainty that belongs at the root level of experience, below interpretation and above sensation. Like knowing you are awake, which is a knowledge so basic that it doesn't require evidence. I was not alone in the clearing, and the thing I was not alone with was large and patient and old, and entirely aware of me, not in the way of an observer but in the way of a surrounding medium. The way water is aware of what moves through it. I made my measurements. I collected my samples. I photographed everything. I was professional and systematic and thorough, and all the while the certainty persisted, and I let it persist, and I sat with it the way you sit with a piece of music that you do not fully understand but that is doing something to you that you cannot deny. At one point I stopped writing and I said out loud, into the clearing, "I'm here." I don't know why. The words were out before I had decided to say them, the way the footprints in the western section had appeared, as a fact that preceded its own explanation. And the forest received the statement in silence, but the silence was different afterward. Thicker, in some way. More complete. I noted the time, 1:17 in the afternoon. I noted the words I had spoken. I noted, with the precision I had trained myself to maintain even in situations where precision felt inadequate, forest silence changed quality following spoken statement. Duration of altered quality, ongoing. Then I packed my instruments, shouldered my pack, and walked back to camp, and the entire walk back I was aware of the clearing behind me the way you are aware of a fire, not by seeing it, but by the warmth it projects forward through the dark. On the evening of the 4th day, I found the photographs. I want to stop here and be very clear about what I mean. I did not find photographs that someone else had left behind. I found photographs in my own field camera, photographs I had taken, verified by the camera's metadata, time-stamped correctly within the survey period. I found these photographs because I was conducting my nightly review of the day's documentation, as I always do, transferring images from the field camera to my backup drive and logging them. The photographs were of the clearing. Taken from a perspective I did not remember occupying, from an angle that would have required me to be positioned outside the clearing's perimeter, at the tree line, looking in toward the center. I had never stood at that position. I had entered the clearing from the south and had remained centrally positioned for the entire 4-hour survey. The photographs were not possible from where I had been. There were 16 photographs. They were taken at intervals of approximately 8 minutes over the course of about 2 hours. In each photograph, visible at the center of the clearing, was a figure. Small in the frame, given the distance from the tree line to the clearing's center, but unmistakably there. Standing still, in most of the photographs. In 2 of the photographs, crouching. In one of the final photographs, in a position that appeared to be sitting, cross-legged, facing away from the camera. The figure was me. I was wearing exactly what I had worn that day. The pack was visible in the photographs where I was standing. The size and posture were correct. I sat with this for a long time. I went through every rational explanation I could assemble. The camera had malfunctioned and taken photographs with corrupted metadata, incorrectly dated or timestamped. I had, in a state of partial awareness or exhaustion-induced automatism, moved to the tree line and taken these photographs and then returned to the center with no memory of doing so. The photographs were artifacts of some kind of sensor anomaly that had produced a figure-shaped pattern in the tree line imagery. I applied each explanation in turn with genuine effort. None of them held. I spent the rest of that evening doing something I had not done since my first year in the field. I wrote in my journal not as a researcher but as a person. Not observations, not measurements, not the clinical language of professional documentation. I wrote what I was feeling, which was not fear but something adjacent to fear, something that shared fear's texture while being oriented differently. Fear is reactive. Fear comes from threat. What I was feeling was more like standing at a height and looking down and feeling the pull that height produces, not the fear of falling but the awareness of the possibility, the awareness of everything that stands between where you are and the ground, which is only your own decision to stay where you are. I wrote for almost 2 hours. When I finished I read what I had written and I did not recognize the voice entirely. It was mine, the vocabulary, the sentence structures, the characteristic movement of my thinking, but it was a version of mine that had been stripped of certain habitual defenses. More direct. More willing to say the obvious true thing without qualification or hedge. I wrote, at one point, I came here to understand what was here. I understand now that understanding is not what this place wants from me. What it wants is for me to stop pretending that understanding is the same as knowing. I read that sentence several times. I am still not entirely sure what it means. I am also, months later, not sure that it is wrong. On the 5th morning, I made the decision to stay 2 additional days beyond my planned exit. This was not a professionally rational decision. My planned survey was complete. My data collection was thorough. There was no professional justification for extending the stay. I made the decision anyway, and I documented my reasoning in my field notes, with a transparency that I think speaks to the state I was in. I cannot leave this place until I understand what this place is trying to tell me. That is not research language. That is the language of someone who has stopped being a researcher and started being something else. I knew this. I stayed anyway. The 5th day was quiet in a new way, the quiet of a conversation that has reached a pause, not the quiet of a conversation that has not yet begun. I moved through the corridor with a different orientation than I had in the first days. Not surveying, not collecting, not documenting in any systematic sense. Simply moving. Simply being present in the way that the forest seemed to invite presence, without agenda or direction. I found the depression on the 5th afternoon. This was a geographical feature I had somehow not encountered in 4 days of survey work, which itself was strange. It was large enough that it should have appeared in any systematic coverage of the area. It was a circular depression in the terrain, perhaps 50 meters in diameter, several meters deep at its center, oriented in the landscape as though it had been placed deliberately at the intersection of the main drainage patterns. The depression was filled, at its center, with water, a still pool, dark with tannins, reflecting the canopy above with a fidelity that made you uncertain, looking at it, whether you were looking down at water or up through a hole in the world. Around the edge of the pool, the carved wooden stakes I had found in the western section continued in a complete circle, a full perimeter, older than those I had seen before, their carvings almost completely absorbed by lichen and moss. The pool was completely still. No surface movement, no ripple, no evidence of input or output. It neither fed anything nor was fed by anything that I could identify. It simply held its water with the absolute stillness of a mirror. I sat at the edge of the pool for a long time. The sound, the low rhythmic infrasound, was present here more strongly than anywhere else I had been in the corridor. Not louder, exactly, but more focused, more directional, as though the depression itself was the source rather than the medium. I placed my hands on the ground and felt nothing mechanical, no vibration that my fingertips could register, but the sense of the sound persisted, woven into the air around the pool the way scent is woven into a room, ambient and inescapable. I looked into the pool. My reflection looked back. And then my reflection did something that I did not do. I am going to write this plainly, without the scaffolding of doubt and qualification that I could construct around it, because I promised honesty. My reflection in that still dark water moved. Not a movement that could be attributed to surface disturbance. The surface was completely still. Not a movement of light or shadow. The sky above was uniformly overcast, featureless, without the play of cloud movement that could produce the illusion of motion in reflective water. My reflection, in the pool, turned its face slightly to one side, the way a person turns their face to hear something better, and then was still again. I sat for a moment longer. Then I stood and walked back to camp. I did not run. I was deliberate about not running, not out of bravado but because I understood, in some way that felt certain and central, that running was not the appropriate response. That whatever this place was doing, it was not threatening me. It was showing me something. The showing was the entire point. The pool, the reflection, the long preparation of arranged stones and carved markers and impossible photographs. All of it was directed toward this moment of showing, and the showing was not meant to harm. It was meant to be seen. What I had seen, I was going to need the rest of my life to understand. That night, the last night I stayed in the corridor, I did not sleep. I sat outside my tent in the total dark without a light, and I let the forest do what the forest was doing, which was, I had finally arrived at the vocabulary for it, remembering. That was the handwritten note's meaning, the note in the archive folder, the note I had spent years trying to decode. The trees remember what we have forgotten. The forest was remembering. Not in the way that stone or soil can be said to hold the record of past conditions, a passive geological archive, but in the way that a living system holds its history, integrated and active and continuously informing the present moment. The forest was old enough and dense enough and sufficiently isolated from human interference to have arrived at a state of integrated complexity that I did not have the scientific framework to describe. Something was operating in the corridor that was as real and as functional as any system I had ever studied, and it was operating on a timescale and in a register that human presence ordinarily disrupts before it can be perceived. The restriction had not been placed to protect a rare fungal network. I had known this for 3 years without fully knowing it. The restriction had been placed because someone, 20 years ago, had understood enough about what was in this place to understand that the ordinary traffic of human recreational use would be catastrophic to it, not in the way that recreational traffic is catastrophic to fragile ecosystems, through physical damage and introduced species, but in a different way. In the way that noise is catastrophic to something that communicates through silence. I do not know what the adverse ecological event was, 20 years ago. I have my theory. I think something happened here that the forest had been building toward for centuries, some threshold or integration that the natural conditions of the corridor had finally permitted, and I think that the survey crews who were sent in to document it had experienced something that they did not have the language or framework to report, and that the administrative response had been to seal the area and wait for further understanding that never came, because further understanding required someone willing to stay long enough to actually understand, and that takes a particular kind of patience that institutional science does not always have. I sat in the dark and I thought about my mother. I thought about the mornings in the old forest, her hand raised to the canopy, her patient teaching of the language of trees. I thought about the sentence she had taught me that I had spent my career trying to put into practice. Most people walk through a forest the way they drive through a city. I had been trained to pay attention. I had been brought here, in some sense that I do not mean metaphysically, by exactly that training. The forest had been here for centuries. The system in the forest had been building towards something for centuries. And I had arrived, on a Tuesday in October, with a key that had cost me 3 years of my life, and I had been willing to stay long enough to be noticed. I do not think I was the first person to be noticed. I think the markers and the arrangements and the pool represent a long history of human encounters with this place that stretched back to before there were restricted access signs, to before there were national forests, to before there was a government with the authority to place restrictions on anything. I think the people who left those markers understood what the place was well enough to mark its perimeter and to point toward its center and to leave carvings that teetered always at the edge of meaning, that said in the language of form what they could not say in any spoken tongue. This is a place that is alive in a way you do not have the right words for. Be careful. Be present. Do not look away. The handwritten note in the archive was not a warning. I had read it as a warning for 3 years. Do not go back in unless you are certain you can tolerate knowing. But sitting in the dark of the corridor on its final night, I understood it differently. It was not warning me away from knowledge. It was asking whether I was ready to carry it. Because the knowing, whatever version of knowing you arrived at in this place, whatever the pools showed you, whatever the silence told you, was not the kind of knowing that stays politely in the wilderness and leaves you unchanged when you return to your ordinary life. It was the kind of knowing that reorganizes you. Permanently. Not dramatically, not in any way that other people would necessarily see from the outside. But in the way that light reorganizes a room it enters, everything that was in shadow becomes visible, and nothing looks quite the same afterward. I was sitting in the dark, and I was thinking about what it meant that a living system could become complex enough that its complexity was indistinguishable from intent, and I was thinking about whether that distinction mattered, and I was slowly becoming certain that it did not. I left on the 6th morning. The walk back to the gate was different from the walk in the way that any return journey through a landscape you have come to know is different from the initial passage through it. I was no longer observing the corridor. I was inside it in a different way than I had been inside it on the approach. The trees that had seemed enormous and oppressive and slightly threatening on the first morning were, now, simply enormous and old and present, in the way of things that have existed long enough to have outgrown the need to impress anyone. The silence was the same. But I had stopped experiencing the silence as an absence. I was experiencing it as the sound of something listening, which is not the same as no sound at all. I reached the gate and I stood in front of it for the second time, and again I was aware of the weight of the metal in my hand, the key turning in the lock, the gate swinging outward. But the weight felt different now. Coming in, the key had felt like a credential, a permission slip for an entry I was entitled to but not certain was wise. Going out, it felt like a responsibility. The kind you carry quietly because there is no other way to carry it. I locked the gate behind me. I looked back through it once, into the forest, into the deep green-gray light that belonged to a different time of day than the time of day it actually was, and I stood there long enough to feel whatever the feeling was that the forest offered in the way of farewell. Then I walked to my truck, put my pack in the back, and drove down the deteriorating double track toward the maintained gravel and the maintained gravel toward the 2-lane road and the 2-lane road toward the 4-lane highway, and at each stage of the return the world refilled with infrastructure and noise and signal, and I let it, because that was what returning required. But the corridor went with me, in the way that the knowing I described goes with you, not as a memory, not as an experience filed away in the appropriate folder of past events, but as a change in the quality of your attention. As a permanent alteration in what you notice when you walk through the world. I want to tell you what I think happened in the Veldren corridor, because I think you deserve a direct answer to the question I raised at the beginning. What happened in that forest? What happened is this: a living system, operating on a timescale that dwarfs human civilization, at a level of complexity that human science is not yet fully equipped to describe or measure, reached me. That is the most accurate statement I can make. It reached me the way a large body of water reaches a shoreline, not with intent, not with desire, but with the simple and overwhelming fact of its own nature. And being reached by something that old and that complex and that patient produced, in me, a series of experiences that my ordinary categories could not contain. The impossible photographs were real. The sound was real. The reflection in the pool was real. I do not have adequate explanations for any of them, and I have made my peace with not having adequate explanations. What I found in the corridor was not a government secret. It was not a supernatural phenomenon in any of the theatrical senses that word usually carries. It was not a monster or a ghost or a manifestation of ancient evil. It was something both more ordinary and more extraordinary than any of those things. It was a forest that had been left alone long enough to become fully itself. And fully itself was something that 19 years of scientific training had given me the tools to approach but not quite the vocabulary to describe. The same way 19 years of music education can give you the tools to analyze a symphony but cannot fully account for what a symphony does to you when you hear it in a dark hall and the hair rises on your arms and something in you that does not have a name responds with recognition to something it has never heard before. The markers have been there for a very long time. The pool has been there for a very long time. The clearing with the blue-gray moss has been there for a very long time. And the corridor has been reaching people who were willing to stay long enough to be reached for as long as there have been people in that landscape. I am one of them now. That is what my reflection in the pool was showing me. Not a threat. Not an omen. Just a fact, offered with the patience of something that has plenty of time. I had joined a long, quiet conversation that had been in progress for centuries. I had earned my place in it the way you earn your place in any long conversation. By arriving, by staying, by listening more than you spoke. I filed my research report. The ecological data was solid and interesting, and I was thorough and professional in its presentation. I made no mention of the experiences I have described to you tonight. There is no scientific framework in which those experiences can currently be reported, and I am not interested in being the person who invents one on the basis of a single encounter. What I put in the report was what I could demonstrate. What I am telling you now is what I know. There is one more thing. The last thing. When I returned to my office and transferred all of my field data to my main drive, I discovered that the audio recording I had made on the evening of the third day, the recording that should have captured the sound of the forest and instead captured nothing, contained, at the very end, a duration of 47 seconds that I could not account for. The recording was 6 minutes and 22 seconds long. I had noted in my field log that I had recorded for approximately 6 minutes. The final 47 seconds were not silence. They were the sound of someone speaking, very low, very calm, in a voice that I did not recognize and in words that I could not make out, not because the audio quality was poor, but because the words were not in any language I could identify. The prosody was wrong for any language I had ever heard. The sound of the voice was human, but the rhythm of the speech was not. I have sent that recording to 3 different audio analysis professionals. 2 have told me the voice is real, genuine human phonation, not an artifact or a glitch. 1 has told me the voice is not human, that the phonetic range exceeds what the human vocal tract can produce. None of them have been able to identify the language. The recording is 47 seconds long. When I listen to it in the dark, with headphones, the hair rises on my arms. Not from fear. From the same recognition I described, the recognition of something I have never heard before, but that something in me knows. The way you know music in a language you don't speak. The way you know, standing at the edge of a very old forest, that the language being spoken around you is real, and that your inability to understand it is not a limitation of the language. It is a limitation of your patience. Go to the forests. The old ones, if you can find them. The quiet ones. The ones that the roads don't reach and the trails don't cross and the noise doesn't penetrate. Go there and stay long enough to stop performing your own presence. Long enough to stop narrating your experience to yourself in real time, that constant inner commentary that keeps us always one layer removed from the actual texture of being alive. Stay until the silence stops feeling like an absence, and starts feeling like a substance. Stay until the dark stops being something you are inside of and starts being something you are part of. The world is older than our ability to understand it. Much older. And in certain places, if the conditions are right and the time is long enough and the human presence that would disrupt it has been kept at bay, something grows in the world's age that is entirely real and entirely beyond our current frameworks and entirely, impossibly patient in its waiting. It was there before we arrived. It will be there after we are gone. And in the in-between time, this brief, urgent, noise-filled interval of human civilization, it waits in the places we have not yet managed to damage, and it holds its history, and it reaches, with the slow, enormous patience of something that measures time in centuries rather than minutes, toward whatever we have left of the capacity to be reached. I was reached. I am not the same. And the greatest horror I carry from the Veldran corridor is not any single impossible thing I witnessed. It is this, the awareness of how close I came to never going in. How many years of professional skepticism and institutional caution I had built between myself and the gate. How nearly I chose the familiar comfort of the known over the necessary terror of the true. The horror is not what the darkness contains. The darkness contains something ancient and real and worth the cost of your certainty. The horror is the darkness you build inside yourself, board by careful board, to avoid ever having to find out.